Thank you, Julie. Previous talks in this series have focused on rare books in the library's collection. Today I'm talking about a rare piece of paper, which is also in the library's collection. It's the sort of thing that most people would have thrown away, but this one has survived, and we've got it. It's a ticket in the first lottery ever held in Australia, 170 years ago, when lotteries were illegal. The concept of a lottery can be traced back to ancient Rome or so, but in England, they go back to about the 16th century. They were mostly for charitable purposes or to build government infrastructure like highways or bridges or something like that. However, as with any form of gambling, some people did it to excess, and in 1808 a committee of the House of Commons described what they termed a dreadful scene of vice and misery brought on by lotteries, by which children, servants and other unwary persons have been ruined. In 1826, the UK Parliament banned lotteries because they were contrary to the public interest and subversive of moral and ethical standards. Now, in colonial times, British law applied in New South Wales, and so lotteries were illegal here. And in fact, it wasn't until 1930 that the New South Wales Parliament passed a law allowing lotteries in New South Wales, 1930. We now take lotteries for granted, of course, but Australia's first lottery actually took place in 1849. It was illegal, it was surrounded by controversy, but the government turned a blind eye because it seemed the only way of averting a disaster. The disaster was the virtual collapse of the economy of New South Wales in the early 1840s. The crisis was to a large extent due to the cessation of convict transportation. So long as New South Wales received Britain's convicts, the British government paid money to the local economy, not only for their accommodation and food and so forth, but also for infrastructure, building of roads and public buildings and that sort of thing. So with the cessation of transportation in 1840, all these subsidies were withdrawn, causing a scarcity of money and putting a severe brake on public works. There was widespread unemployment, and also farmers who had been having difficulties with the prolonged drought and who relied on the free labour of convict servants assigned to them, convict labourers assigned to them, suddenly found that their farms were unprofitable when there were no more convicts to give free labour to the farms. So a lot of farms became unviable, and the economy generally was in serious danger of collapse. This depression in the early 1840s punctured a balloon of speculation in land in the 1830s. There had been excessive speculation in real estate, fuelled by the willingness of the banks to lend to speculators on the basis of land which really was at inflated prices. They got loans at very large amounts of money, giving their land as a security, but the land wasn't worth as much as the loan that they were given. Fancy banks doing that. When land values collapsed and mortgage repayments couldn't be made, the banks came into possession of tens of thousands of properties which were given as security for the loans. And the banks thus found themselves with inadequate assets to cover the deposits and other liabilities because the land was worth very little. And in March 1843, one of the colony's major financial institutions, the Bank of Australia, collapsed. In those days, there was no concept of limited liability as we have today. And so legally, the shareholders of the bank were personally liable to cover its debts. But most of the shareholders' assets were also in land investments and therefore worth very little. So the concept or the prospect of widespread disaster loomed. The bank's directors decided that there must be a levy upon all shareholders, and that in order to assist them to meet the levy, the bank's assets should be divided amongst the shareholders. The bank's real estate holdings were very diverse, from large farms and prominent city buildings to small, unproductive and almost valueless rural allotments in distant country areas. In total, the bank identified 11,248 pieces of real estate. The directors considered how best to divide this 11,248 items, pieces of land, among the shareholders, and they decided the fairest way would be by lot. It was therefore decided that the assets would be numbered from 1 to 11,248. The same number of tickets would be printed and numbered, and the tickets would be issued to the shareholders in proportion to their shareholdings. So if you had 5% of the bank's shares, you got 5% of the lottery tickets. As a private arrangement among the shareholders, this was not a public lottery, and so it wasn't illegal. But quite a few of the shareholders didn't want to participate because they were afraid of getting a very small and probably worthless, almost worthless, piece of land instead of a major prize. And it was therefore agreed that shareholders who didn't want to participate could sell their tickets to somebody else. And there were lots of advertisements in the newspapers at the time, shareholders wanting to sell their tickets. This made it more like a public lottery, and it was felt that some legal permission was required. Fortunately, some of the shareholders and directors of the bank were members of the Legislative Council, and they drafted a bill which would allow the bank to dispose of its property assets by lottery. The bill was referred to a committee chaired by William Charles Wentworth, who was a major shareholder in the bank. Wentworth's committee reported favourably on the bill, and it was passed by the legislature. Apparently the concept of conflict of interest wasn't very well known in New South Wales at that time. However, the governor, Sir George Gipps, refused to give the royal assent to the bill because he doubted whether the colonial legislature could pass a law which was in conflict with the law in Britain. He referred the bill to London for decision by Queen Victoria. In doing so, Gipps made it clear in his dispatch to London that although he personally disapproved of lotteries, the paramount consideration for the good of the colony should be the settlement of the Bank of Australia mess by almost any means. He concluded his report by saying, "It would give me much pleasure could the bill be allowed by Her Majesty, though I can scarcely venture to hope that it can be." Indeed, Gipps' dispatch to London was accompanied by a petition from the bank's directors to the Queen, setting out the reasons why the bill should be allowed. Essentially, they argued that settlement of the bank's affairs would greatly relieve the present economic depression of the colony. The state of the markets made it impossible for the bank's assets to be disposed of by sale, and the proposed lottery was the only effective means of resolving the situation and restoring value to the economy. These appeals, unfortunately, were in vain. The British government advised the Queen not to give the royal assent on the grounds that, however worthy the cause, public lotteries are regarded with the highest disfavour by Parliament and by public opinion. The Queen's advisers also noticed the apparent conflict of interest that had gone on in New South Wales with the people who were most affected drafting the law and then voting for it. There were a whole lot of other legal challenges which we don't need to go into, and the whole thing dragged on until 1848 when the Privy Council finally ruled that the bank's shareholders were indeed personally liable for the bank's debts, and the whole thing blew up again. The prospect of widespread bankruptcy and disaster in the economy. Well, it required a desperate remedy, and the directors confirmed their decision to have a lottery without formal legal sanction on the rather shaky grounds that there was no law in New South Wales expressly forbidding a lottery. So in October 1848, 11,248 tickets were printed and issued to the shareholders in proportion of their shareholding. As expected, many shareholders preferred to sell their tickets to a third party, and the assignment value was set at £4. That's the ticket that the library owns. It was issued to a shareholder named Duncan McKellar, and it's signed by 4 directors of the bank, including Macleay from the Macleay Museum. McKellar sold his ticket to another person, but unfortunately it's very difficult to read what is on the back of the ticket. All tickets carried this form to be filled in if it was sold. It says, "In consideration of £4 which I have received from blank, I hereby assign to him all my right and interest in the within ticket and drawing." And the original ticket holder, Mr. McKellar, filled in the name of the purchaser and signed it, and it was then the ticket, and any prize it won was then the property of the purchaser whose name was on the back of the ticket. It's worth noting, as I said, the tickets were priced at £4 each. £4 in 1849 is equivalent to something like $1,000 today. So they weren't cheap, but many of the prizes were very attractive. The bank issued a list of the prizes in order of their importance and value, and that's on the table today. The most valuable prize, said to be worth £6,000, which is about $1.5 million today, comprised 2 large farms, one of more than 8,000 acres, including 3,700 head of cattle, in the Dungog district north of Newcastle, and the other farm of 64,000 acres on the Liverpool Plains. That was worth about £6,000. The second most valuable was £3,000. It was a parcel of several public houses and cottages in inner Sydney, plus a public house and 2 acres of land at Woolloomooloo, plus a farm on the Nepean River and other smaller properties. That was about £3,000. The list is in order of value. So item number 1 is the most valuable. That's the $6,000 one. Item number 2 is the $3,000. The third item on the list was the normal institution, Elizabeth Street, Sydney, fronting Hyde Park. That was a school on the site where David Jones Elizabeth Street shop is now. And there were 11,200 other prizes. They included many houses and shops and pubs in Sydney and suburbs and country towns, a huge number of housing or farming allotments, presumably forfeited by bankrupt developers. For example, there were bankrupt real estate subdivisions in Newtown, Lane Cove, Tempe, along Burke Street, Surrey Hills, to name only a few. There were 700 acres of land at Kiama, all subdivided and ready to go. There were other large holdings in Maitland, Wollongong, Gosford, Camden, Yass, and elsewhere. It was an enormous portfolio of property, some of it very valuable, but the majority were small allotments outside of Sydney, alleged to be worth about £4 each, which was the price of the ticket. The lottery was a great novelty. It caused tremendous excitement because lotteries were banned. There'd never been one before. Nobody had ever experienced a lottery before. The prospect of obtaining a valuable property for only £4 caught the popular imagination. I'd love to own, farms at Dungog and 3,000 head of cattle and whatnot for £4. And despite the fact that the bill allowing it had been outlawed by both the colonial governor and the Queen, the local authorities decided to avert their gaze. They realised that this was the only feasible way of avoiding the economic disaster which crippled the colony if the Bank of Australia mess was not cleared up. Sydney was a long way from London. Queen Victoria didn't need to be told everything that was going on. There was a new governor. As I said, Governor Gibbs had vetoed the bill, but by this time, 1849, a new governor, Sir Charles Fitzroy, had come, and perhaps his view of lotteries was less rigid. But public opinion was certainly on the side of the lottery. Every ticket won a prize. It seemed to be a lottery that you couldn't fail. The drawing of the prizes was set for January the 1st, 1849, and it took 3 days to complete. It was conducted in the City Theatre in Market Street, which is approximately where the State Theatre is now. Crowds besieged the City Theatre for 3 days. Market Street was closed because of the mobs trying to get into the theatre to see if their ticket was going to win something valuable. People were desperate to witness what was going on. Later on, the Sydney Morning Herald published a list of all the tickets and all the prizes, but they wanted to know now. The drawing was quite a complicated affair, and it's described in the list of prizes. Unlike today's lottery, where the first ticket out gets first prize and the second ticket gets second prize and so on, this was done with 2 wheels. There was a ticket wheel and there was a lot wheel. And the ticket wheel was spun and a ticket number was drawn. And then the lot wheel was spun and that ticket won that prize. So there were two reasons to be excited. Will my ticket be the next one to win? And if so, what will it win? And this went on for 3 days. There's a breathless report in the Herald by one of their reporters. It's a little bit long, but it's worth reading. Who that saw that can ever forget the rows upon rows of anxious purchasers of tickets, male and female, daily and all day long, crowded in the pit and boxes of the City Theatre? Who can ever forget the eager looks, the patient and sustained listening to the announcements of the numbers of the tickets as drawn, the hard breathing and the excitement whenever something considered a prize was drawn, the almost audible groans of the old woman as a Fitzroy fell to her? Fitzroy was current slang for something contemptible and worthless, which was an allusion to alleged malfeasance by the governor and his sons. As I said, the Herald published a list of all the prizes, and I'll bet you're all wondering who won the first prize. The large farming properties near Dungog and on the Liverpool Plains valued at £6,000. The winner was a 6-year-old boy named Angus MacDonald, one of the children of a Scottish farm labourer who lived near Maitland. His father had bought several tickets and had given one to each of his children, and I'll bet the shareholder who sold that winning ticket was kicking himself. The father, because the boy was only 6, the father assumed ownership of the prize properties as guardian for his son until the boy turned 21. This would have changed his life. Imagine, you're a labourer on somebody else's farm, and suddenly you're managing, effectively owning, properties in Dungog and on the Liverpool Plains, all for £4. Unfortunately, Mr. MacDonald didn't live to enjoy his triumph. 3 months later, he was killed by falling off his horse on one of the properties, and his widow had to apply to the court to become the boy's guardian and run the farms on his behalf. Now, I don't know whether anybody has ever researched the family history of this family, but what a terrific story. The family fortune established by a child winning an illegal lottery. Most other ticket holders were not as fortunate as Mr. MacDonald or the young MacDonald. By one estimate, there were about 200 properties which could be considered valuable, but the other 11,000 or so were really small allotments in distant parts of the country, frequently poorly subdivided and difficult to identify, and therefore almost worthless, at least in the short term. One disgruntled winner wrote to the Herald and described them as worthless scrub, inhabited by snakes, hundreds of miles in the interior, where they are likely to remain unclaimed for a century to come. Some disappointed winners advertised their tickets for sale, presumably at less than the original £4, just to get rid of them, rather than take possession of their properties. What did the library's ticket win? From the Herald's list, it won prize number 9536, which is on this page towards the very end of the list of prizes which were in order of value. It won only a small acreage somewhere inland from Port Macquarie, allegedly worth the £4 it cost its buyer, but hardly worth bothering about. Indeed, its buyer didn't bother to collect this prize, which is why the ticket has survived. In order to collect your prize, you had to hand the ticket in to the bank, and they cancelled it and then delivered the prize. But a lot of people who won these very small, distant country allotments couldn't be bothered. They didn't want the property. And so most uncollected prize tickets were thrown away, but this one has survived. Remarkably, it seems that about 1,500 of the 11,000 tickets have survived in archives and collections. There are 13 tickets in the National Library's collection. There are 23 in the Mitchell Library's collection, and the Fisher Library has this one. This one was donated to the library in the 1960s by a man called Harry Lipton. He was a German Jew who fled the Nazis and finished up in Sydney. He married Rachel Mandelbaum, who died in 1978 and left her estate to the university to establish Mandelbaum House, which is a residence for Jewish students in Darlington. So this was Rachel Mandelbaum's husband owned that ticket. How Mr. Lipton came by it, we don't know. All these tickets survived because their owners couldn't be bothered collecting the almost valuable, the almost worthless prizes. But the Mitchell Library has a further 1,400 or so cancelled tickets as part of its archive of the Bank of Australia's records. So there were about 1,400 cancelled tickets in the Mitchell and about sort of 50 others, which, like this one, were never cashed in. And finally, I've got 2 tickets in my own collection, which is what started me doing research on all this. I think it's a remarkable story that deserves to be better known.
Can you tell me, do you know any of the story or the history behind your own tickets?
The story behind my own tickets. They were given to me because they were going to be thrown away. They came from my brother. My brother was the executive director of the New South Wales Cricket Association, and they had been in the same office building in the city for many decades, but they were moving. And they had a strong room attached to the office where they had their archives, their minute books, ledgers and whatnot. And my brother assigned one of the staff to pack up the strong room. And he said, if you find anything that you don't think needs to be moved to the new place, just put it aside and we'll consider it for disposal. So this chap came to my brother afterwards and said, I packed up the strong room and I found this envelope. And it's got these 2 old bits of paper in it. I don't know what they are, but I've read them and they don't mention cricket, so I don't think they're relevant to our archives. So my brother looked at them and he had no idea what they were either. But my brother knew that I collect rare books as a hobby, and I might know something about old things. They're dated 1849, so, until it's old, it'll be old. So my brother showed them to me and explained how he came by them and said, what do you think they are? And I didn't have any idea what they were. And I said, well, what are you going to do with them? And my brother said, well, we're going to toss them out unless you want them. So I said, oh, yeah, righto, I'll take them. And that's what got me started on what is the Bank of Australia lottery. And that's how I discovered all of this about the illegal lottery and all the rest of it.
Australia survived?
Bank of Australia survived.
Yeah.
It broke in 1843, stopped trading. The directors carried on until 1849 to finalise the distribution of the assets, and then ultimately followed up.
When's the next lottery?
The next lottery was 1930, when Jack Lang was Premier, who was desperate for money during the Depression, and he got the Parliament to pass a bill allowing lotteries, and the churches objected. But in order to shut the churches up, Jack Lang promised that all the profits would go to hospitals. And because the churches, particularly the Catholic Church, ran a lot of hospitals, they couldn't very well say, no, we're not going to have a lottery because we don't want the money. And we've had lotteries ever since.
given all the public interest, you talked about the mob outside the area where they were doing the draw, so given all the hype that built up about it, did a black market develop at all in relation to transferring the tickets, or was it all through the proper due process and the £4 that you talked about?
Question is, because of the great excitement among the public about this, was there any kind of a black market in selling or requiring tickets? Not that I know of. There are lots of advertisements in the newspapers offering them for sale, and you had to apply to particular agents and so on to get it. I've never found any suggestion that there was any black market, and so far as I can tell, everybody paid the £4. They thought it was cheap to get one of these wonderful prizes. They didn't realise there were also 11,000 crappy prizes.
So people who won a prize and then they don't cash it in, what happened to those lots?
What happened to the unclaimed pieces of land? I don't know. I assume that they were simply given back to the borrower who had put them into the bank as security for his loan. But I don't know. It could be that they went in some other way, they were distributed in some other way. I haven't found any records about what happened to the unclaimed ones. The bank did try to have a second lottery in the middle of 1849 because they found a whole lot more properties that hadn't been in the first lottery. That was banned by the government. The government by then thought, well, we've had one lottery and it's illegal, that's enough. But more interesting, if I can just go on for another minute, William Charles Wentworth, who was, as I said, a director of the bank and got the bill through the local parliament and so on, he thought, gee, this is a neat way to get rid of property that we can't sell because of the Depression. He was a great property investor. He had a lot of pieces of property all around. He needed some money to pay his levy on shareholders of the bank, because they all had to pay to deal with to cover the bank's liabilities. So William Charles Wentworth announced a lottery that he was going to run for himself, with his property investments as the prizes. And he was selling tickets at £5 a ticket, and I think he was planning to make £60,000 out of it. And these were advertised in the paper in the middle of 1849. Again, the Attorney General stepped in and said, come on, this is illegal. A lottery to clear up the Bank of Australia is one thing, but a lottery in your benefit to give you £60,000 is quite another thing. And he was threatened with arrest and imprisonment and so on if he went ahead, which he didn't. So we had to refund everybody's £5.
Did you discover whether any of the winners who won very big holdings, whether any of those holdings became famous properties that have survived till today or survived in history?
Did I discover that any of the lottery winnings, the important ones, later became well-known buildings or well-known people, I suppose, who won them? Yeah. No, I didn't. Like any lottery, you're tremendously interested until it's drawn.
Yes.
And then when somebody else wins something good, you lose interest completely. And there's no records that I've seen in the local papers about the person who won some land at Woolloomooloo doing something wonderful with it. No, it's just the excitement died down as soon as the prizes had been announced, so far as I can